Picture this. A man bound in chains today could be crowned with golden laurels tomorrow. In the heart of ancient Rome, where death was entertainment and glory was earned in blood, there existed a world where the lowest of society could rise to heights that even senators envied. Their names were chanted by 100,000 voices. Their faces were carved in marble. Emperors sought their favor. Yet many began their journey in the slave markets, worth no more than a bag of grain. How did men who owned nothing, not even their own bodies, become the richest celebrities in the ancient world? How did they cheat death daily in the most dangerous sport ever conceived? And what dark secrets lay hidden beneath the thunderous roar of the Circus Maximus? The answers lie in the dust and blood of the greatest arena Rome ever built. The year is 67 AD. The morning sun casts long shadows across the Circus Maximus, the greatest racing circuit the world has ever known. 7 laps, 12 chariots, 1,800 feet of pure terror. But this is no ordinary day. Today, a slave named Crescens steps into his chariot, knowing that before the sun sets, he could be dead or he could be free. The Circus Maximus was not merely a racetrack. It was a crucible where human souls were either forged into legends or crushed beneath spinning wheels. Stretching nearly 2,000 feet in length, this colossal structure could hold a quarter of Rome's entire population. When filled to capacity, it housed more people than many cities. Yet, for all its grandeur, the circus held a terrible secret. The mortality rate among charioteers was so high that few lived past their 20s. The Romans had a saying, "He who enters the circus embraces death." But why would anyone willingly face such odds? To understand their motivation, we must first understand their origins. The majority of Rome's greatest charioteers began life in the most wretched circumstances imaginable, as slaves. These were not ordinary servants. Many were prisoners of war, captured from distant lands and brought to Rome in chains. Others were born into bondage, their fate sealed before they drew their first breath. In the eyes of Roman law, they were property, no different from a horse or a piece of furniture. A slave's life was worth approximately 2,000 denarii, roughly the same as a good racing horse. They could be bought, sold, beaten, or killed at their master's whim. Most would live and die in obscurity, their names forgotten before their bodies grew cold. But some possessed a quality that set them apart, a reckless courage that bordered on madness. These were the ones selected for the racing stables, the factions. They were chosen not for their freedom, but for their willingness to risk everything for the slimmest chance of gaining it. Rome's chariot racing was dominated by 4 great factions, each identified by their colors: the reds, blues, whites, and greens. These were not merely teams, they were vast enterprises that controlled every aspect of the racing world. Each faction owned thousands of horses, hundreds of chariots, and armies of slaves trained in the deadly art of chariot racing. The investment was enormous, and the stakes were higher still. A single race could make or break fortunes, topple governments, or start riots that claimed thousands of lives. The factions recruited their charioteers from the slave markets, looking for specific qualities: small stature to reduce weight, quick reflexes to avoid disaster, and above all, absolute fearlessness. Once selected, these men entered a world where every day might be their last. But here lies our first mystery. If these men were slaves, owned body and soul by their faction masters, how could they ever hope to gain wealth and fame? The answer lay in a system so bizarre that it defied all logic, a system that would transform slaves into the richest men in the empire. The Campus Martius training grounds at dawn. Here, in the shadow of Great Rome, slaves learned to become gladiators of the racetrack. But this was no gentle schooling, it was a brutal education in survival. Charioteers trained with wooden chariots first, learning to balance on the precarious platform while controlling not one, but often 4 powerful horses. The reins were tied around their waist, a practice that would prove both their salvation and their doom. Why tie the reins to their bodies, you might wonder? Speed and control. With the leather straps secured around their torso, a charioteer could use his entire body weight to guide his team, leaving his hands free to wield his whip and fend off rivals. But this connection also meant that if their chariot overturned, They would be dragged beneath thundering hooves unless they could cut themselves free in time. Each charioteer carried a curved knife for this purpose, the coulter. Many a race was won or lost in the seconds it took to decide whether to cut the reins and lose the race, or risk being trampled to death. The training was merciless. Dawn to dusk, they practiced starts, turns, and the most dangerous maneuver of all, the turn around the meta, the stone markers at each end of the track. Here, chariots traveling at full speed had to navigate a hairpin turn while other teams attempted the same feat mere inches away. Now we come to the heart of our mystery. How did slaves accumulate wealth when everything they earned belonged to their masters? The answer lay in the prize system that governed Roman racing. While the official prize money went to the faction owners, there existed an intricate network of bonuses, tips, and unofficial rewards that could flow directly to successful charioteers. Wealthy Romans, including senators and even emperors, would place massive bets on races. A charioteer who delivered a victory could expect generous gifts from grateful patrons. More importantly, successful charioteers could negotiate their contracts, securing a percentage of winnings and appearance fees. But the real wealth came from an unexpected source: the Roman people themselves. Successful charioteers became folk heroes, and the citizens would shower them with coins, jewelry, and gifts. A single victory lap could net a champion more money than a skilled craftsman earned in a year. Consider the case of Gaius Appuleius Diocles, perhaps history's greatest charioteer. Over his 24-year career, he won 1,462 races and accumulated winnings equivalent to over $35 billion in today's currency. Yet he began his career as a property-less slave from Spain. But what of the dangers that made such rewards possible? The Circus Maximus was a killing ground disguised as entertainment. 7 laps around the massive track meant 14 death-defying turns around the meta. Chariots reached speeds of up to 40 miles per hour, extraordinary velocity for vehicles with no suspension, pulled by animals whose training was often incomplete. The most feared occurrence was the naufragium, the shipwreck. This was what Romans called a multi-chariot crash, and when it happened, the results were catastrophic. Horses would tumble, chariots would splinter, and men would disappear beneath a chaos of wood, leather, and flailing hooves. Archaeological evidence from racing venues shows the brutal reality. Crushed skulls, shattered bones, and bodies so mangled they could barely be identified. The sand of the circus was regularly soaked with blood, and slaves stood ready with rakes to smooth away the evidence before the next race began. Yet, despite these horrors, or perhaps because of them, some charioteers developed an almost supernatural ability to survive. They learned to read the rhythm of a race, to anticipate disasters before they happened, and to execute maneuvers that seemed to defy the laws of nature. The Roman people's fascination with their racing heroes bordered on obsession. Successful charioteers were treated like modern sports superstars, their images appearing on pottery, jewelry, and wall paintings throughout the empire. Fans would learn intricate details of their favorite drivers' lives, their racing records, their personal habits, even their romantic entanglements. Some charioteers had followers who would travel hundreds of miles to watch them compete. This adoration translated into real power. A beloved charioteer could influence public opinion, calm riots, or even sway political decisions. Emperors, who understood the importance of keeping the masses entertained, cultivated relationships with successful drivers. The Emperor Caligula was so enamored with chariot racing that he allegedly planned to make his favorite horse, Incitatus, a consul. While this may have been exaggerated, it demonstrates the elevated status that racing commanded in Roman society. But for every Diocles who lived to enjoy his fame and fortune, dozens died young and forgotten. The average career of a charioteer lasted only a few years. Most were dead before their 25th birthday, their names carved on simple tombstones that recorded their victories along with their age at death. These tombstones tell a story of incredible achievement compressed into impossibly short lives. Here lies Fuscus, charioteer of the Blue faction, winner of 53 races, died aged 24 years. Such epitaphs were common in the cemeteries surrounding Rome. The psychological toll was equally severe. These young men lived in constant awareness that each race might be their last. They developed superstitions and rituals to ward off disaster, prayed to gods both Roman and foreign, and formed bonds with their horses that often transcended their relationships with humans. Yet some did survive long enough to earn their freedom, manumission as the Romans called it. But how exactly did a slave purchase his liberty when he technically owned nothing? The answer reveals the complex economics of Roman slavery. Successful charioteers could accumulate their peculium, a personal fund that, while technically belonging to their master, was traditionally respected as the slave's own money. Masters had practical reasons to honor this system. A charioteer who believed he could buy his freedom raced harder and took greater risks. The price of freedom varied, but for a valuable charioteer, it could cost between 10,000 and 50,000 denarii, equivalent to several years of a soldier's pay. Yet, for successful drivers, this sum was achievable within a few seasons of racing. Once freed, these former slaves faced a paradox. They were now Roman citizens with full legal rights, yet many chose to continue racing. Why would a free man return to face the same mortal dangers that had claimed so many of his brothers in bondage? Here we approach the deepest mystery of Roman chariot racing, the transformation of human nature itself. These men, who began as powerless slaves, became something unprecedented in the ancient world, celebrities whose fame transcended social class. But their success came at a terrible cost, not just in lives lost, but in the very humanity of the spectators who cheered their suffering. The Romans created a system where human beings were willing to risk death for entertainment, where the lowest members of society could achieve the highest honors, and where the line between sport and slaughter disappeared entirely. The charioteers themselves embodied this contradiction. They were both victims and beneficiaries of Rome's brutal entertainment culture. Their courage inspired millions, yet that same courage was built upon desperation and the absence of alternatives. As we return to that day in 67 AD, we find Crescens positioning his chariot at the starting line. The fabric barrier, the mappa, flutters in the emperor's hand. 100,000 voices rise in anticipation. Crescens knows the mathematics of his situation. Of the 12 men who will begin this race, statistics suggest that at least one will not finish alive. The odds of any individual charioteer dying in a given race were approximately 1 in 8, horrifying by any modern standard, yet accepted as routine by Roman society. But Crescens also knows something else. If he survives this race and wins it, he will earn enough to purchase better equipment, attract wealthy patrons, and move one step closer to the ultimate prize, his freedom. If he wins enough races, his name will be remembered long after emperors are forgotten. The mappa falls. The race begins. History records that Crescens not only survived that day but went on to become one of Rome's most celebrated charioteers. Like Diocles before him, he accumulated vast wealth, purchased his freedom, and lived to an age that few of his profession ever saw. But Crescens was the exception, not the rule. For every slave who raced his way to freedom and fortune, dozens died in pursuit of the same dream. They were willing to face impossible odds because, for them, the alternative was a life of hopeless servitude. The Roman chariot racing system created the world's first sports superstars, but it did so by exploiting the most desperate members of society. It offered genuine hope of advancement while simultaneously feeding on human misery. It celebrated courage while demanding that such courage be demonstrated through mortal combat disguised as sport. These slaves who became superstars were not merely entertainers or athletes. They were living symbols of Rome's greatest contradictions. A civilization that could produce magnificent art and literature while finding joy in watching men die for sport. An empire that spoke of honor and virtue while building its prosperity on the backs of human property. A people who created laws and institutions that would influence the world for millennia while cheering as desperate men risked everything for a chance at dignity. The dust has long settled in the Circus Maximus. The thunderous roar of the crowds has faded to silence. But the story of these remarkable men, slaves who dared to dream of freedom and found it at the end of 7 laps around a track of death, remains one of history's most extraordinary tales of human courage in the face of impossible odds. In their brief, blazing careers, they achieved something that even Rome's greatest generals and politicians never could. They transcended the circumstances of their birth and wrote their names in immortal bronze. They proved that, in the crucible of mortal danger, the human spirit could transform even slavery into stardom. Their legacy is complex and troubling, inspiring and tragic. They were heroes born of a system we rightly condemn, yet their individual stories of courage, determination, and ultimate triumph over seemingly impossible circumstances continue to resonate across the centuries. The slaves became superstars, but the price of that transformation was measured in blood, suffering, and lives cut tragically short. In the end, they gained their freedom not despite the brutal system that enslaved them, but because of their willingness to risk everything within that system's deadly embrace.